They thought they could arrange my life behind my back, as if I were a doll with no voice, as if my place in this family had been written long before I arrived, a role where I should simply smile and nod while they discussed my husband's future, and even his new wife, as though I had never existed beside him, as if my feelings and the years of marriage we shared were nothing but a page they could tear out and replace with a fresh one. I remember that evening clearly, the sharp scent of expensive wine, the delicate chime of crystal glasses, and the hushed voices of my mother-in-law and brother-in-law, as they leaned toward my husband, whispering how it would be easier for all of us if he just took a more suitable girl, and how I could be handled quietly. They spoke of a house, not ours, but a shared home, where the new wife would rule, and I would be erased like an inconvenience. My chest burned with humiliation, while they laughed softly, though not with their eyes, only with their lips, masking cruelty as casual banter. That was the moment I realized the game had no rules anymore, that someone intended to rewrite my destiny without my consent. But what they never counted on was my father, a man of iron who never broke his word and never stood idle while someone tried to break his daughter. And what none of us yet knew was that his single move would shatter every piece of their carefully crafted plan. They had always treated me like an outsider, though I pretended not to notice, convincing myself that family dynamics were complicated and that eventually they would warm up to me. But the truth was more bitter. From the day I married my husband, his parents and siblings saw me not as his partner, but as a temporary placeholder, someone filling space until they could maneuver him into the life they imagined for him. They controlled everything: holidays, finances, even the way he should dress. And when I tried to suggest alternatives, I was brushed aside with polite but sharp smiles that reminded me I was never truly welcome. I told myself I could endure it for love, that my loyalty and patience would be enough to earn my place. Yet years of compromise only taught them that my silence was permission. They demanded more, they expected more, and soon, they no longer even bothered to hide the disdain in their voices when they mentioned better matches or more suitable women for their precious son. My husband would just sit there, half smiling, pretending it was harmless teasing, but the weight of those words sank into me until I could barely breathe. The night I overheard their plan, the air in that room turned poisonous. They weren't just imagining a different life for him. They were already arranging it, outlining where he and this new wife would live, what traditions she would carry on, how my presence was nothing more than an obstacle to be erased. I sat frozen, every word slicing through me, and my husband's silence was the deepest cut of all. Not once did he defend me. Not once did he remind them I was his wife. He just let their voices wash over him, as though they had the right to reshape his life, and mine. That was when I realized this wasn't just betrayal, it was annihilation, and if I didn't act, they would succeed in writing me out of my own story. What they didn't see, what they had always underestimated, was the quiet power of my father. They thought he was distant, uninvolved, too dignified to interfere. They thought his silence meant weakness. They couldn't have been more wrong. Because my father had been watching from the sidelines, collecting details, noticing patterns I had been too blinded by love to admit. And when the time came, he would step into their world with the kind of authority none of them had ever faced before. His voice carried more than opinion. It carried finality. And once he spoke, nothing would ever be the same. The weeks that followed that evening were like walking through a minefield. Every glance, every whisper in that house felt heavy with meaning, as though they were daring me to speak up, daring me to resist the new script they were writing for my life. My husband became distant, his phone constantly buzzing with messages he never shared, his eyes shifting away whenever I asked simple questions. His mother called him daily, not to ask how we were, but to remind him of obligations, of appearances, of the bigger picture. And slowly, I started to see the cracks that had always been there. His reluctance to make decisions without her, the way he deferred to his father's approval on even the smallest things, the way he treated me as though my role was conditional, temporary, fragile. The mask was slipping, and what lay beneath was terrifying. They had always planned for me to be disposable. Then came the moment that confirmed it. His sister, smug and careless, let it slip during a family dinner that things will be easier once she's gone. Her fork clinking against the plate, as if she hadn't just dropped a bomb. My husband didn't even flinch. He didn't correct her, didn't defend me. He just sipped his drink in silence, his eyes fixed on the table. I felt my chest tighten, my pulse race. But I forced my face into calm, because showing them my pain would only feed their cruelty. That night, I went home and sat in the dark, replaying every moment, every comment, every silence that had led us here, and I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about power, about control, about their obsession with shaping every detail of his life. They wanted a puppet, not a man, and certainly not a marriage built on love. They had underestimated me for too long, thinking I was weak, naive, dependent. But what they didn't know was that my father had raised me differently. He had taught me to stand firm, to see through lies, to recognize manipulation even when it was dressed up as tradition or family duty. And while they plotted in hushed voices, he was preparing his own move. They thought they held all the cards, but soon they would learn that one unexpected hand could overturn the entire game. It was my father who finally broke the silence, not with anger or drama, but with the kind of deliberate calm that makes people stop breathing. He invited them all to dinner, something he rarely did, and the air that night was thick with anticipation. They came dressed in their finest, smug smiles plastered on their faces, certain they were about to corner me into submission. My husband looked uneasy, glancing between me and them, as though he knew something was coming, but didn't dare speak it aloud. My father waited until the meal was nearly over before he placed a folder on the table, his hand steady, his expression unreadable. "Since you've all been so eager to make plans for my daughter's life," he said quietly, "I think it's time you saw mine." The room fell silent. My mother-in-law's smile faltered. My father opened the folder and slid out documents, property records, financial agreements, contracts signed years before my marriage that none of them had bothered to ask about. "This house you keep discussing, this future you've been planning," he continued, "rests on foundations you don't control. Half of what you think belongs to your family is tied to me, and by extension, to her." He pointed at me, his voice firm but calm. My brother-in-law shifted in his chair, color draining from his face. My husband stared at the papers, as though seeing a foreign language. My father leaned back and folded his hands. "You speak of replacing her as if she's a burden. What you don't realize is that without her, without me, all your plans collapse. You don't have the right to erase her. You never did." The weight of his words pressed into the room like stone. My in-laws exchanged frantic glances, their certainty unraveling before my eyes. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across their faces. Not of me, but of him, of the man who had just shifted the balance of power entirely. I sat there in silence, my heart pounding as I realized what he had done. With a single move, my father had dismantled their scheme, not by pleading or fighting, but by proving that they had no authority, no leverage, no future without me. And in that moment, everything changed. After that night, the atmosphere around my in-laws shifted, like a storm breaking, sudden, violent, and impossible to ignore. They stopped speaking to me directly, their eyes darting past me as if I were a shadow in the room. But their silence spoke louder than their insults ever had. My mother-in-law, once so smug and commanding, now measured every word, her confidence replaced by caution. My father's documents had cornered them, showing that half of what they claimed as theirs could vanish the moment I chose to enforce my rights. They could no longer treat me as disposable when my presence was the only thing keeping their fragile world intact. My husband grew restless, caught between loyalty to his family and the reality his father-in-law had laid bare. He avoided me, avoided them, drifting like a man who had lost his script and didn't know his next line. And yet, instead of reaching for me, he buried himself in silence, letting the weight of his family's expectations crush him. It hurt. God, it hurt. To see him choose passivity over love. To realize he would rather be their obedient son than my devoted husband. But that clarity became my strength. I began to move differently in their home. No longer shrinking, no longer swallowing my words. When his sister made another careless remark about how things could have been, I met her eyes and answered, "Things are exactly as they should be, because I'm still here." She had no response, just the flush of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. My father checked in on me often, his presence a steady reminder that I wasn't fighting alone, that I came from strength, not weakness. And slowly, I understood the deeper lesson he had given me. Their power had always been an illusion, fed by my silence and my husband's compliance. The moment someone stood up and exposed the truth, their entire empire cracked. That realization lit something inside me, something steady, unshakable. I would not be erased. I would not be replaced. And if my husband couldn't stand with me, then he would stand alone. The turning point came sooner than I expected. A week later, I received a call from my father, not with warnings or advice, but with an invitation. "Come by the office," he said simply, his tone as calm as ever. When I arrived, he handed me another folder, heavier this time, thick with papers. I barely understood at first glance. "These are yours now," he told me. "Everything tied to the agreements I made years ago. I've transferred full control to you." My breath caught in my throat. He wasn't just protecting me anymore. He was empowering me, giving me the authority to stand on my own 2 feet, armed with proof that their empire was as much mine as it was theirs. My hand shook as I flipped through the documents, shares, property rights, legal clauses that spelled out in black and white what they had tried so hard to deny. That evening, when I walked back into my in-laws' house with that folder tucked under my arm, something in me had shifted. I no longer felt like an outsider. I was no longer the quiet wife they could sideline. I was an equal, if not more. My husband looked at me with a mix of confusion and unease, as though he sensed I had crossed a line he could never drag me back from. His mother's face tightened the moment she noticed the folder, her eyes narrowing with a flicker of recognition. She knew. They all knew. I laid the documents on the table, just as my father had done before, and spoke with a calmness that surprised even me. "You talked about plans, about replacing me, about building a life that didn't include me. But here's the truth. Without me, you lose everything you're clinging to. You don't get to decide my future. You don't even get to decide your own without my consent." The silence that followed was suffocating. My brother-in-law fidgeted in his chair, my sister-in-law's smirk finally slipping away. My husband stared down at the papers, his jaw tight, but no words came. And in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. They could glare, they could whisper, they could plot all they wanted, but the balance of power had shifted. My father had handed me the key, and I was no longer the girl they thought they could erase. I was the woman who could end their game entirely. From that day on, the dynamic in their household was unrecognizable. They still gathered, still tried to present the same image of superiority and unity to the outside world. But behind closed doors, their voices were sharper, their laughter forced, their arguments impossible to hide. I became both the center of their silence and the weight they couldn't escape. Every move I made reminded them that their imagined future, the one where I was erased and replaced, had been dismantled. My mother-in-law could no longer summon me like a servant. My sister-in-law no longer dared to let her tongue slip. And my brother-in-law avoided me entirely, knowing I held more than enough leverage to crush his smug arrogance. My husband, though, was the hardest to watch. He hovered between resentment and fear, caught in a limbo where his loyalty to them was eroding. But his pride kept him from turning toward me. He started coming home later, his excuses flimsy, his eyes unable to meet mine. And every time he sat across from me at the dinner table, the silence stretched so long, it felt like another betrayal. I realized then that I didn't just hold power over his family. I held the choice of whether he belonged in my life at all. The man who had once sworn to protect me had sat quiet while his family plotted my erasure. That silence was something I could never unhear. My father visited again, quiet but observant, his gaze sweeping across the house, like he could feel the tension vibrating through the walls. Afterward, he told me something that stayed with me. Strength isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go. Those words echoed in my mind in the nights that followed. I had spent years convincing myself that patience and love would be enough to carry us through. But patience had only fed their cruelty, and love had been one-sided for far too long. Now, with the proof in my hands and the silence in my husband's eyes, I understood. I didn't need him. I didn't need their acceptance. And I didn't need to fight for a place in a family that never wanted me. I had my own name, my own power, and a father who had shown me that no one, not even the people I once called family, could erase me without my permission. The unraveling came slowly, like a thread pulled from a sweater. But once it started, there was no stopping it. My husband's family began to turn on each other, each one blaming the others for letting things slip beyond their control. His mother accused his sister of speaking too freely. His sister hissed that his mother had pushed too hard, and his brother muttered that my husband had been too weak to keep me in line. I watched them devour each other, and for the first time, I felt no fear, only clarity. The empire they had built on arrogance and manipulation was collapsing from the inside, and I didn't have to lift a finger. My husband grew bitter in the middle of it all, retreating into silence, his pride wounded by the fact that his father-in-law had done more to protect me than he ever had. Some nights he wouldn't even come home, and when he did, he carried the stench of alcohol and defeat. He tried once, only once, to confront me. He stood in the doorway of our bedroom, his voice low and edged with frustration. Why couldn't you just let things be? I turned to face him, steady and calm, the same way my father had faced them. Because letting things be meant letting them erase me. And you were willing to watch it happen. His eyes flickered, but no defense came. He knew the truth, and the truth silenced him more than I ever could. From that moment, I stopped waiting for him to change. I stopped hoping he would finally stand up for us, for me. Instead, I began to think about what my life could look like without him, without their constant shadow over me, without the suffocating weight of their expectations. I met with lawyers. I spoke to financial advisors. And with each step, the knot around my throat loosened. The power my father had handed me wasn't just a shield, it was a door. And every day, I moved closer to walking through it, leaving behind the family that had tried to bury me, and the man who had never fought to keep me. The day I finally made my move, the sky was heavy with rain, the kind that seemed to echo the weight of decisions. I sat across from my lawyer in his polished office, the folder of documents open between us, and signed my name with a hand that no longer trembled. Each stroke of ink felt like cutting a tether, severing the ropes that had bound me to a family that had never truly seen me as one of their own. By the time I set the pen down, the decision was sealed. I was filing for divorce, and I was securing every legal right tied to my father's agreements. No more whispered threats, no more erasure. My husband came home late that night, soaked from the rain, his shirt clinging to his shoulders, his expression hollow. He knew. I didn't have to say a word. He stood in the doorway, staring at me as if hoping I might still waver, still choose the life we had built on silence and compromise. But I didn't move. I simply looked at him, steady, waiting for the words he never found. His family, on the other hand, erupted. Phone calls poured in, their voices frantic, desperate, bargaining, accusing, every tactic they had ever used. But this time, I didn't shrink. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I let their words fall useless, because they no longer had power over me. My father stood by my side through it all, a quiet force, reminding me that strength wasn't always loud, that sometimes it was in the calm refusal to bend. And in that calm, I began to see glimpses of the life ahead of me, one without their constant shadow, one where I was free to rebuild on my own terms. As the rain tapped against the windows that night, I lay awake and thought about the woman I had become. They had tried to erase me, to replace me, to rewrite my story without my consent. But here I was, pen in hand, writing it myself. And for the first time in years, the silence around me wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. When the papers were finally served, the fallout was immediate and brutal. My mother-in-law called me within the hour, her voice trembling with rage, spitting accusations about betrayal, about how I had destroyed the family. I listened in silence, letting her fury burn itself out, because I knew the truth. This family had destroyed itself long before I ever stood up to them. My husband didn't come home that night. Instead, I heard from neighbors that he was seen at his brother's house, pacing the driveway with a cigarette in hand, his shoulders hunched like a man who had lost everything but didn't know how to admit it. I felt no triumph in that moment, only a deep, steady calm. For years, I had begged for his loyalty, for him to choose me over their control, and he never had. Now, the choice was no longer his to make. I had taken it into my own hands. Days turned into weeks, and with each one, the silence from his family grew louder. They had tried every tactic, anger, guilt, even fake apologies, but none of it mattered anymore. The documents my father had entrusted to me were unshakable, and with my lawyer guiding each step, I tightened the boundaries around my future. My father came by often, sometimes saying nothing at all, just sitting across from me with that quiet strength that reminded me I wasn't alone. One evening, he looked at me and said, "You're finally living on your own terms." And for the first time, I truly believed him. I walked through the house that used to feel like a cage, touching the walls, the windows, the furniture, and realized that it was no longer theirs. It was mine because I had chosen to claim it. And with each breath, with each decision, I shed the weight of their control, until what remained was me, whole, unbroken, and free. The day of the court hearing felt like the final curtain call to a performance I had been forced into for years. I walked into the courtroom with my lawyer by my side, and my father sitting quietly in the back row, his presence steady like a stone. My husband was already there, his tie crooked, his face pale, his family clustered around him like vultures, pretending to be protectors. They glared at me, whispering furiously, their eyes burning with the kind of hatred that comes when people realize their power is gone. The judge read through the filings carefully, his tone clipped, professional, but each word was another nail in the coffin of their illusions. When he confirmed my legal rights to the properties and shares tied to my father's agreements, I saw my mother-in-law's jaw tighten until it trembled. When he acknowledged that the divorce would proceed with me retaining full control of assets in dispute, I caught my sister-in-law muttering under her breath, shaking her head like a child denied a toy. And when the gavel finally struck, sealing the decision, I watched the last trace of smugness drain from my husband's face. He had smirked for so long, certain that his family's influence would shield him, certain that I would fold under pressure. But in that moment, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply stood, gathered my things, and walked out of the courtroom with my father at my side. Outside, the sky was bright and clear, the air crisp, as though the world itself had opened up after years of suffocation. My father glanced at me and gave the smallest nod, and I understood the meaning without words. The fight was over, and I had won, not through cruelty or revenge, but through the strength of refusing to be erased. For the first time in years, the future wasn't something they were planning for me. It was mine, entirely mine, and I was ready to live it on my own terms. In the weeks after the divorce was finalized, the silence from their side became deafening. No more calls, no more manipulations, no more half smiles laced with venom. It was as though they had vanished, retreating into the shadows of their own humiliation. I heard whispers through neighbors, through mutual acquaintances, arguments behind closed doors, financial strain showing where once they flaunted their wealth. Their house, once the stage for every performance of superiority, now stood cold and shuttered, curtains drawn tight as if hiding the collapse within. My husband, or rather my ex-husband, never reached out. I imagined him pacing in silence, wrestling with the truth that he had allowed it all to slip through his fingers by standing mute when his voice could have mattered. But by then, it no longer concerned me. I had stopped waiting for apologies that would never come, stopped yearning for loyalty that was never mine. Instead, I poured my energy into rebuilding, not just the life they had tried to strip from me, but the woman I had nearly forgotten I was. I spent time with my father, walking through the gardens he had always loved, listening to his stories, not as a daughter seeking protection, but as a woman, finally understanding the lessons he had been teaching me all along. Strength is quiet, boundaries are power, and dignity is never negotiable. Slowly, the shadows they had cast over me lifted. My laughter came back, hesitant at first, then stronger, filling the spaces where fear used to live. The house that had once been a battleground became a sanctuary, a place where I could sit with a cup of tea and hear only my own thoughts, free of their poison. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls gold, I realized the final truth. They had tried to erase me, to replace me, to rewrite my story without me, but all they had done was sharpen me into someone they could never break. Their plans lay in ruins, but I remained whole, standing, unshaken. And that, more than anything, was the revenge they never saw coming. Freedom didn't arrive with fireworks or applause. It settled quietly, like sunlight pouring into a room long kept in darkness. I woke up one morning and realized I no longer checked my phone in dread of their messages, no longer rehearsed answers to questions laced with cruelty, no longer carried the heaviness of waiting for the next blow. My days became my own. I started making choices for myself, small at first, like repainting the kitchen walls, changing the furniture, cooking meals that I enjoyed instead of the ones his family approved of. But each choice grew bolder, until one day I looked around and realized nothing of them remained in my home, not even the shadows. My father watched it all quietly, proud without needing to say it. He knew I had not only defended myself, but reclaimed my life. Sometimes, he'd sit with me in the evenings, sipping tea, and we'd talk about things beyond all of this. Dreams, plans, memories of my mother. Those conversations healed me more than I expected, reminding me that I came from a place of strength, not weakness. My ex-husband tried once, months later, to cross my path. He showed up at the edge of my driveway, hands in his pockets, eyes searching for the woman who once waited for him to choose her. But I didn't step out. I didn't need closure, didn't need explanations. He had made his choice in silence, and I had made mine in strength. I simply watched through the window as he stood there, waiting, until eventually he turned back to the life he had chosen, and lost. My in-laws never recovered the control they worshipped so much. Their power had always been illusion, and once it shattered, it never returned. And as for me, I learned that survival is not just about holding on. It's about letting go when the grip burns your skin. They wanted me gone, forgotten, erased. Instead, I became untouchable, stronger than they could have ever imagined. And in the quiet peace of my own life, I finally understood. Their downfall wasn't my victory. It was simply the consequence of underestimating me. With every passing season, I grew lighter, as though years of suffocation were finally lifting off my chest. The house became mine in every sense, not just in paperwork, but in spirit. I filled it with warmth, with laughter from friends who had always stood quietly on the sidelines, waiting for me to step back into myself. I planted flowers in the garden that his mother once declared impractical, and I watched them bloom brighter than anything she had ever touched. Each petal was a reminder that beauty thrives where control is absent. My father saw the change in me, and one evening he said softly, "You are no longer surviving, you are living." His words sank deep, because they were true. I no longer woke each day carrying the weight of proving myself to people who never wanted me. I no longer waited for loyalty from a man who chose silence over love. Instead, I stood fully in my own life, and it was enough. More than enough. I began to travel, to see places I had once only dreamed about, unafraid to move beyond the narrow walls they had tried to confine me within. Each new step was proof that freedom wasn't loud. It was steady, patient, healing. From afar, I heard whispers of their decline, arguments spilling into the open, financial troubles worsening, the facade of their perfect image crumbling piece by piece. But I didn't gloat. I didn't even care. Their collapse was theirs to endure, just as my healing was mine to embrace. And the irony, the cruel poetry of it all, was that in trying to erase me, they had erased themselves. I would sit on my porch some evenings, tea in hand, watching the sun dip low, and I would smile, not in triumph, but in peace, because in the end, My greatest revenge wasn't in destroying them. It was in building a life so whole, so untouchable, that they no longer mattered at all. Time became my ally, smoothing over scars that once felt raw and permanent. The bitterness that had once lived in my chest slowly gave way to something steadier, something softer, resilience. I no longer replayed their words at night, no longer woke with the sting of humiliation. Instead, I woke with plans, real plans. For myself, I started taking courses, sharpening skills I had set aside during my marriage, investing in my own growth. Every new step felt like reclaiming a piece of the woman I had been. Before they tried to bury me under their expectations, my father watched with quiet pride, always reminding me that moving forward was the only true victory. He never gloated, never stoked the fire of revenge, but he didn't need to. His faith in me was enough, and it fueled me more than their cruelty ever could. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of my ex-husband around town, his shoulders hunched, his gaze distant. People whispered that he looked smaller, that without the weight of his family propping him up, he drifted like a man with no anchor. I never approached him, never spoke his name aloud. He was a closed chapter, one I had no need to reread. His family, once so loud and imposing, had shrunk into silence too. Their gatherings grew sparse, their influence evaporated, their perfect facade shattered for everyone to see. And yet, I carried no triumph in my heart for that. My revenge had already been written, not in their downfall, but in the way I had risen. On quiet evenings, sitting in the garden my father and I tended together, I would feel the peace settle deep into me. They had once tried to write me out of my own story, to replace me without hesitation. But I was still here, stronger, wiser, untouchable. And the greatest truth I carried with me was this: I didn't just survive them, I outlived their hold on me. My life was mine now, fully and completely. And nothing they did or didn't do could ever take that away again. Seasons passed, and with them came a kind of quiet joy I had almost forgotten was possible. My mornings began with the light pouring through open curtains, instead of the heavy weight of expectation pressing down on me. I filled my days with things that belonged only to me. Long walks through the market, afternoons spent reading in the sun, evenings where laughter from my own circle of friends echoed in rooms that had once felt like a cage. I no longer thought of myself as the woman who endured their cruelty. I thought of myself as the woman who had walked through fire and emerged whole. My father, older now but still sharp, would sometimes place his hand over mine and say, "This is the life you chose. Don't forget that." And I never did. Each decision I made, whether it was investing in a small business, traveling to cities I had dreamed of, or simply enjoying dinner without anyone's approval, was mine. That was the power they had never wanted me to discover. I heard of my ex-husband only through whispers, that he had drifted further into bitterness, that his family's grip on him had left him hollow. There was a time when that knowledge might have hurt me, but now it barely stirred anything inside. Their downfall was no longer my concern. I had long since outgrown the need to measure myself against their failures. Instead, I measured my days by peace, by freedom, by the steady rhythm of a life that was truly mine. And in that quiet, I finally understood the full circle of it all. They had tried to erase me, to replace me, to silence me, but their cruelty had only carved me into someone stronger, someone they could never reach again. The greatest revenge was not in watching them fall. It was in rising so far beyond their reach that their voices no longer echoed in my world. And as I stood on my porch one evening, watching the sun slip below the horizon, I smiled. Not with bitterness, not with triumph, but with peace, because the story they tried to steal from me was still mine, and I had written the ending on my own terms. Years later, I could barely recognize the woman I had been when this all began. The quiet, compliant wife who swallowed her pain in the name of peace. She felt like a ghost, someone who lived in the margins of her own life. In her place stood a woman who had learned not only how to survive, but how to thrive, how to claim space without apology. My world was no longer measured by their approval, or poisoned by their disdain. It was measured by the sound of my own laughter, by the freedom of waking up each morning with choices that belonged only to me, by the steady calm of knowing I had walked away from their darkness and never looked back. My father remained my anchor, his presence reminding me always of where my strength had come from. He would sometimes glance at me with quiet pride, never needing to say the words aloud, I had become the woman he always knew I could be. And though time moved forward, the lesson of it all stayed carved into me. That power is not given, it is claimed. And that silence in the face of betrayal is its own kind of consent. I no longer carried anger for my ex-husband or his family. They were relics of another life, buried beneath the choices they made and the empire they tried to build on lies. I carried only gratitude for the clarity their cruelty had given me, for the strength I had discovered in myself, and for the peace I had found in walking away. The revenge they never saw coming wasn't the collapse of their plans or the loss of their influence. It was me, living a life untouched by them, a life so full and untouchable that their names meant nothing anymore. And as the years stretched ahead, wide and open, I knew with certainty that the story I had written for myself was far greater than the one they had once tried to force upon me. By the time I reached the final chapter of that part of my life, their shadows had faded completely. The woman who once sat at their table in silence was gone, replaced by someone who carried herself with a calm strength that didn't need to be announced. My days no longer circled around survival, they bloomed with purpose. I invested in myself, in projects that mattered, in friendships that filled my heart instead of draining it. I traveled to places I had only dreamed of, stood in front of oceans and mountains that reminded me just how small their cruelty truly was, compared to the vastness of the world. My father, proud but never boastful, continued to walk beside me in his quiet way, watching as I built a life that was mine alone. Sometimes, when I caught his gaze, I understood that my healing was his victory too, that he had not only protected me, but set me free. My ex-husband, I heard, had grown older without ever growing wiser. The smirk that once defined him had hardened into bitterness, the weight of his family's collapse dragging him into mediocrity. But I did not dwell on him, because he no longer lived in my story. He had made his choice to remain silent, and in doing so, he had chosen his own erasure. The irony was never lost on me. The family that tried to erase me had vanished into irrelevance, while I, the woman they dismissed as fragile and replaceable, had built something stronger than any of their schemes. And in that truth, I carried no vengeance, only peace. The greatest revenge was never their ruin. It was my rebirth. They had underestimated me, written me off, and in doing so, they had given me the chance to discover the life they could never touch. And as I stood in the quiet of my own home, sunlight streaming through windows that once witnessed so much pain, I smiled with certainty. The story they tried to steal was mine all along, and I had written the ending in strength, freedom, and undeniable peace. Looking back now, I see how every moment of pain had shaped me into the woman I am. Their betrayal, his silence, the endless schemes whispered over wine and polished silver, all of it had been meant to crush me, yet instead, it carved out a deeper resilience than I ever believed I had. I remember the girl who once doubted her worth, who thought patience and sacrifice would earn her a place in their family, who begged silently for scraps of respect that never came. That girl is gone. In her place stands a woman who no longer waits to be chosen, no longer lowers her voice to be accepted, no longer bends herself small to fit into someone else's version of home. I live freely now, in a life they could never imagine for me. I travel without asking permission. I surround myself with people who see me, not as a placeholder, not as a duty, but as a woman worthy of love and respect. I have found peace in solitude, joy in new friendships, and purpose in the work I pour myself into. My father's wisdom follows me still. His quiet lessons about boundaries, strength, and dignity echo in every decision I make. He gave me the tools, but I built the foundation. And the beauty of it all is that I no longer measure myself against their collapse. Their silence, their bitterness, their shrinking lives are not my trophies. My victory is the life I wake up to each morning, a life free from fear, free from their control, free from the chains of a man who never found the courage to stand for me. The irony is sharp and poetic. They wanted me erased, but it is they who have faded into nothingness, while I have become more visible, more alive than ever before. And as the years stretch out before me, wide and unwritten, I know this truth will remain. My greatest revenge was never in their destruction. It was in reclaiming my story and living it fully, loudly, unapologetically, in a way they will never be able to touch. And so this chapter of my life closes not with rage, not with bitterness, but with the kind of calm only earned by walking through fire and refusing to be consumed by it. They once believed they could erase me, that I would fold under the weight of their contempt, that I would vanish quietly. while they rewrote the future to suit themselves. But I am still here. I am stronger than I have ever been, standing on ground that belongs entirely to me, breathing air that is finally free of their poison. My ex-husband's silence, his family's schemes, their constant reminders that I was never enough. All of it could have broken me, and maybe, for a time it did. But what they never understood is that breaking is not the end. Breaking is where the rebuilding begins. They thought they could define me, reduce me, replace me. Instead, they sharpened me, forged me into someone they will never again have the power to touch. Today my life is mine in every way. I fill it with choices that bring joy, with people who honor me, with memories that no longer ache. My father's wisdom remains my compass, but I have learned to trust my own voice as well. I no longer wait for permission, for validation, for love handed out like charity. I give those things to myself, and in doing so, I have found more peace than their entire empire of control ever knew. Their downfall is no longer my concern. Their whispers, their bitterness, their fading relevance. It all drifts far behind me, lost in a past I no longer live in. The revenge they never saw coming wasn't their collapse. It was my rise. It was the way I refused to be erased, the way I claimed my place in a world they tried to lock me out of, the way I stood tall when they expected me to bow. And as I look forward now, the horizon wide and bright, I carry no fear, no regret, only certainty. I am free, I am whole, and I am living the life they never wanted me to have. The life they could never take away. This is my story, my ending, my beginning, and that is a truth no one can rewrite.